Before you decide that this is simply the price of peace in your family, there is something I need you to hear first tonight. Staying silent when someone you love hurts you again and again in ways too small to name and too frequent to forget, that isn't peace. It never was. And I think somewhere underneath the part of you that keeps smoothing things over, you already know that. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire tonight. Get your tea or your coffee, whatever's keeping your hands warm. Because what we're going to talk about is one of those subjects almost nobody says out loud in families like ours. Not abuse. Not the dramatic kind of hurt that shows up in a courtroom or makes the neighbors talk. The quiet kind. The comment at the holiday table that landed wrong and that everyone pretended not to notice. The favor asked of you and never once returned. The tone someone takes with you that they would never take with a stranger. Because somewhere along the way, you taught them it was safe to. I want to talk honestly tonight about the real cost of staying silent in a family that hurts you gently, over and over, and about what it might finally look like to speak. You know this feeling, even if you've never quite put words to it. You're sitting at the table, and someone says something that lands like a small stone dropped straight into your chest. And you feel your face do the thing it's done for decades now, the polite half smile, the quick swallow, the decision, made faster than thought, not to say anything. You tell yourself it isn't worth it. You tell yourself you're the bigger person. You tell yourself most of all that keeping the peace matters more than whatever small thing just happened to you. None of this is your fault. I want to say that plainly before we go any further, because so much of what keeps women silent in families like ours isn't weakness, and it certainly isn't cowardice. It's love, twisted sideways into something that costs you far more than it should. You learned, probably decades ago, that your voice was the price of harmony. Someone, somewhere, needed you to be easy, to be agreeable, to be the one who never made things difficult, and you paid that price so consistently, for so long, that you stopped noticing you were paying it at all. Think about the specific moments. The sister-in-law who makes the same comment about your weight or your house or your choices every single gathering, and you laugh along because a scene would ruin the evening. The adult child who calls only when something is needed, and you answer warmly every time, swallowing the small hurt of being useful rather than wanted. The sibling who was always the favorite and still is. And you've spent 40 years being gracious about it because someone in the family had to be. The rehearsed sentence you've said in your head, in the car, on the drive home from dinner. 100 times the one you never once said out loud at the table where it actually mattered. Think, too, about the family photograph from last Christmas, the one where everyone is smiling and you are smiling too. And only you know that your smile in that picture is doing a job, holding a line, covering for something that happened 20 minutes earlier that nobody else in the frame even remembers. Think about scrolling past someone else's warm, easy family posts online and feeling that small, unfair twist of wondering what you did wrong to end up managing your own family instead of simply enjoying it. None of that means your family doesn't love you. It only means love and honesty got separated somewhere along the way, and nobody ever quite put them back together. I know that quiet. I know the particular exhaustion of being the one who keeps the peace, meal after meal, year after year, while something in your own chest quietly closes a little more each time. And I know, too, the way that silence doesn't stay in the dining room. It follows you home. It sits with you at night, replaying the comment, drafting the reply you'll never send, wondering what it would have cost really to have just said the true thing instead of the easy one. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from being agreeable for a living inside your own family, and I don't think anyone has ever told you plainly that it has a cost. Not just an emotional one, though that alone would be reason enough, a real one. In your body, in your sleep, in the tightness that sits in your shoulders after a holiday that was, on paper, perfectly pleasant. We'll get to exactly what that quiet resentment does to you over the years, but first, I want you to sit for just a moment longer in the recognition of it, because I think you've been waiting a long time for someone to name this without also asking you to apologize for feeling it. If you've stayed with me this far, what comes next was written with you specifically in mind, because I don't think you clicked on this tonight by accident. Here is the part I haven't said quite this plainly before, even to my own children. For years, I mistook my own silence for grace. I thought that being the mother, the sister, the one who never raised her voice at the table, made me the strong one in the room. I have a memory, still sharp after all this time, of a holiday dinner years ago when someone I love very much said something about me in front of everyone that landed somewhere deep and stayed there. I smiled. I passed the potatoes. I said something light to move the conversation along, the way I always did, the way I'd been doing since I was young enough to learn that a woman's job at the table was to keep it comfortable for everyone else. And I carried that one sentence for years afterward, turning it over at night, rewriting what I should have said, never once saying any version of it out loud until I was well into what I now think of as the second half of my life. I tell you that not for sympathy, but because I suspect you have your own version of that dinner, your own sentence you've been carrying. And before we talk about what to do with it, I want you to understand something important about why it's been so hard to put down. So let's talk honestly about what staying silent is actually costing you, because I don't think anyone in your life has ever laid it out plainly, without judgment, the way I want to tonight. The first honest thing is this: silence in a family doesn't erase the hurt, it just relocates it. Every comment you swallowed, every slight you let slide because naming it felt like too much trouble, didn't disappear. It moved inward. It became a small, cold room in you where those unspoken sentences live. And that room has been slowly filling for years, maybe decades, and it takes something from you that nobody else in the family ever sees. You carry it into your sleep, into your health, into the tightness in your jaw you've stopped noticing because it's simply how you feel now. This isn't a scare tactic, and it certainly isn't a diagnosis. I'm not a doctor, and I won't pretend to be one tonight, or ever. And if anything I'm describing tonight feels bigger than ordinary family tension, please do let a real physician or counselor help you carry it, because that is wisdom, not failure. But you don't need a medical degree to know, in your own body, that swallowing hurt for 30 years leaves a mark somewhere. You feel it in the shoulders that won't quite drop, in the sleep that comes late or leaves early on the nights after a difficult gathering, in the tight breath you take right before walking into a room where you already know what's likely to be said to you. Quiet resentment, held long enough, doesn't stay quiet forever. It simply finds somewhere else in you to live. The second honest thing, and this one is harder to admit, is that your silence has likely trained the people around you, not because they're cruel and not because they sat down and planned it, but because people generally keep doing whatever costs them nothing. If speaking a certain way to you or asking a certain amount of you or overlooking you at the table in favor of someone louder has never once had a consequence, there was never any reason for it to stop. That isn't an accusation against them. It's simply how families, like all systems, tend to work. The people who ask least of themselves are often the ones who've never been asked to. And the third honest thing, the one I think matters most tonight, is this. You were very likely taught this pattern before you ever had a choice in it. Long before you became the peacekeeper at your own table, someone was the peacekeeper at the table you grew up at. Maybe it was your mother, maybe it was an aunt or an older sister, someone who showed you, simply by living it in front of you, that a good woman absorbs, that a good woman doesn't make waves. You didn't invent this role, you inherited it. The way you might inherit a piece of furniture nobody quite likes, but nobody has ever thrown out either. You might be telling yourself right now that naming any of this feels disloyal, like you're betraying the people you love by even thinking it through this clearly. It isn't disloyalty, it's honesty, and there's a real difference between the two, even though they can feel identical in the moment. Loving people and being honest with them are not opposites. They never were. Somewhere along the way, in families like ours, we were taught that they were, and that lesson has cost more women more years of their own lives than almost anything else I've talked about on these evenings together. There's an idea from Jung that fits this inheritance, almost exactly the notion that so much of what we struggle with as adults is not truly our own conflict at all, but something projected onto us from an older, unrelated wound that has nothing to do with the present moment. The relative who snaps at you over something trivial may be carrying a grievance decades older than the conversation you're actually having. The sibling who competes with you at every gathering may be replaying a rivalry that started in a childhood bedroom neither of you has lived in for 50 years. None of that excuses how you've been treated, but understanding it can loosen the grip of a question that has likely haunted you longer than it should have. The quiet, exhausting question of what you did to deserve this treatment. Very often, the honest answer is nothing at all. You simply happened to be standing nearby when an old wound needed somewhere to go. Here's what I want you to understand about why this ache is so specific, so hard to shake, and why it shows up loudest in the quiet hours rather than in the middle of the argument itself. There's a concept from the psychologist Carl Jung that I think about often at this stage of life, the idea that the whole second half of life has its own separate purpose from the first half. In the first half, you're building. You're establishing a family, a role, a place at the table, and much of that building requires you to fit yourself into whatever shape keeps the structure standing. You bend, you absorb, you become whoever the system around you needs you to be, because the system itself feels too important, too fragile to risk. But Jung believed, and I think most women who reach this age come to feel it in their bones, even without ever reading a word of psychology, that the second half of life asks something entirely different of you. It isn't about building the structure anymore. It's about finally becoming the person who was quietly set aside to keep that structure standing all those years. The parts of you that went quiet at the table so the meal could stay pleasant, they don't disappear. They wait. And this stage of your life, whether you asked for it or not, is the stage where they start asking, gently but persistently, to be let back into the room. That's what this ache really is, underneath the surface irritation of one more comment, one more slight, one more meal where you said nothing. It isn't pettiness, and it isn't you finally becoming difficult in your older age, whatever anyone might imply. It's the second half of your life, doing exactly what it's supposed to do, asking you to stop performing a version of yourself that was only ever useful for keeping other people comfortable. There's a related idea I think about just as often, something Jung called the persona, the mask. Each of us builds early on to move safely through the world. In families, that mask often becomes the agreeable one, the easy one, the one who never causes a scene. It served you. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. It likely kept you safe, kept the peace, kept a seat for you at tables where speaking honestly might once have cost you something real. But a mask worn long enough starts to feel like your actual face. And one of the strange, quiet griefs of this stage of life is realizing you've forgotten what your own face looks like underneath it. Jung also wrote about something he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we push out of sight because keeping them visible would cost us too much in the rooms we have to live in. In a family, your shadow might simply be your own honest reactions, irritation, hurt, disagreement, the plain wish to be treated with more care than you're receiving. None of that is ugly. None of it needed hiding in the first place. But you learned, likely very early, that showing it cost you something, a cold shoulder, a guilt trip, a label like difficult or sensitive, so you tucked it away, quietly, meal after meal, until it became almost a stranger to you. The tired, resentful feeling that surfaces at night isn't a flaw surfacing late in your life. It's your own shadow finally asking to be let back into the light of an ordinary evening rather than exiled to the hour after everyone else has gone to sleep. So why does this ache sharpen at night, alone, rather than in the moment the comment was made? Hold on to that question because I think the answer explains almost everything else we're talking about tonight. In the moment, at the table, you're protecting the room. Your whole nervous system is oriented outward, managing the temperature of the gathering, reading faces, keeping things smooth. There isn't space in that moment to also feel the hurt fully. You're too busy managing everyone else's comfort to attend to your own. It's only later, alone, when the managing stops and the room finally goes quiet, that the feeling you postponed gets to arrive. That's why it comes for you at 11 at night instead of at 6 at the dinner table. It was never gone. It was simply waiting its turn, the way every honest feeling eventually does. Now, I don't want you to hear any of this as an indictment of your family, because that isn't what tonight is about, and it never will be here. This isn't about deciding the people who hurt you quietly are bad people who need to be cut away entirely. Almost never is it that simple, and I'd be doing you a disservice pretending otherwise. Most families that operate this way aren't cruel on purpose. They're simply running an old, familiar pattern that nobody has ever interrupted, because you, specifically, have never interrupted it. Which brings me to the part of this I think you've been waiting for. Whether you knew it or not, this pain you've been carrying isn't evidence that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that you are exactly where you're supposed to be in your own becoming. Jung had a word for the process of finally becoming a whole person, gathering back up all the pieces of yourself you set aside to keep other people comfortable. He called it individuation, and he believed it was the real work of the second half of life, not decline, not fading into the background of your own family's story, becoming, finally, undividedly yourself. This isn't the end of your usefulness to the people you love. It's the beginning of being genuinely present with them instead of merely performing peace for their benefit. A woman who has quietly reclaimed her own voice isn't a harder woman to love. She's an easier one to actually know. So let's talk about what speaking honestly might actually look like, because I don't want to leave you tonight with only the diagnosis and none of the medicine. Speaking up after decades of silence does not mean becoming someone unrecognizable at the holiday table. It doesn't mean cutting off the people who hurt you, unless what you're living with has crossed into something that threatens your safety or your dignity. And if that's your situation tonight, please hear me clearly. Your safety comes first, always, before any of the gentler advice I'm about to give. And there is no shame whatsoever in protecting yourself fully from anyone who has truly harmed you. But for most of us, most of the time, speaking honestly is a smaller, quieter act than we imagine it needs to be. It might sound like, the next time that same comment comes at the table, simply saying, gently but clearly, that it doesn't feel good to hear, and leaving it there without apologizing for saying so. It might sound like not laughing along this time. It might sound like a single sentence, delivered calmly, weeks or months before you ever intend to say it, finally spoken instead of rehearsed one more time in the car. You might be telling yourself that speaking up now, after all these years of staying quiet, will only make things worse, that it's simply too late to change the pattern at your age. It isn't. Patterns that took decades to build don't require decades to interrupt. They require one honest sentence, said once, followed by the courage to let it stand without immediately smoothing it back over. The people who love you may be startled the first time you do this. Startling them is not the same as losing them. You also might be telling yourself that if you speak up now, after all these years, people will wonder why you never said anything sooner, and that the delay itself is somehow an embarrassment. It isn't. Nobody who truly loves you will hold your years of quiet grace against you once you finally set it down. And if someone does hold it against you, that response tells you something important about the relationship itself, something worth knowing clearly rather than continuing to wonder about in silence. There's a word for what happens when something held in one extreme for a very long time finally begins tipping toward its opposite. Jung called it enantiodromia. The way a life lived entirely in silence eventually starts producing, almost on its own, the pressure toward its opposite, honesty, voice, presence. You may have already felt the first small stirrings of that pressure, the moments lately when staying silent has started to feel harder than speaking would. That isn't a character flaw showing up late in life. That is exactly what this stage of life is supposed to do. Something is already shifting in you, even tonight, even just from sitting here with me by this fire and letting yourself hear all of this plainly for what feels like the first time. I can feel it in the way you've stayed with me this far, past the parts that were harder to hear. I want you to picture, just for a moment, the next family gathering after tonight. Picture yourself at that same table, in that same chair you've sat in for years, and picture the comment coming the way it always does. But this time, instead of the automatic smile, the quick swallow, the fast subject change, picture yourself pausing, just a breath, just long enough to feel the old instinct rise and choose, deliberately, gently, not to follow it all the way down. Picture the sentence leaving your mouth, quiet and steady, nothing dramatic, nothing you'll need to apologize for later. Picture the small, strange lightness that follows, not because the room erupted or because anyone applauded you, but because for the first time in longer than you can remember, you didn't leave a piece of yourself behind at that table. You'll likely feel your shoulders drop a little in a way you didn't know they'd been raised. The house will feel a little more like yours on the drive home, because you'll be bringing all of yourself back into it, instead of the smoothed-over version you've been bringing home for years. Picture two, a few weeks further on, an ordinary evening at home, no gathering, no audience, just you at your own table, and notice how much lighter an ordinary Tuesday feels once it isn't carrying last month's unspoken sentence along with it. That lightness is not a guarantee that every relationship in your life will transform overnight. It is simply what tends to happen quietly and reliably inside a woman who has finally stopped leaving pieces of herself at other people's tables. Here is what I want you to actually do starting this week, not someday, not once you feel ready, because readiness rarely arrives before the first honest sentence does. Write down the one thing you've been swallowing the longest, the comment, the pattern, the imbalance you've never once named out loud. Write it exactly as you'd say it if you weren't afraid. Even if you never intend to send it or speak it to anyone, let it exist outside your own head for the first time. That single act, private and small as it seems, begins loosening something that decades of silence have held in place. You do not have to deliver a speech at the next holiday table. You simply have to stop pretending, even privately, that it never happened. If this is your story too, I would love to know, what's the one thing you've stayed silent about the longest? The sentence you've rehearsed 100 times and never once said? You don't have to share the details if it isn't ready to be shared. Just tell me that it's there. If you're watching this tonight with your tea or your coffee going cold beside you, tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment, every single one, and I promise you it matters to me to know who's sitting by this fire with me tonight. You are so far from the only woman carrying a sentence she's never said out loud. Tell me I'm not alone in recognizing that in myself too. And let's remind each other tonight that we don't have to carry it silently anymore. What's one thing tonight that made you think differently about the silence you've been keeping? There's no wrong answer, and there's no need to have it all figured out before you write it down. Sometimes the noticing is the whole first step, and the noticing is more than enough for tonight. And if you'd like to sit by this fire with me again tomorrow night, I will be here, same time, same chair, waiting for you. Before we say goodnight, let me leave you with the truest thing I know about this. Staying silent for decades doesn't make you weak, and speaking honestly now doesn't make you difficult. It makes you whole. You are not too late to say the sentence you've been carrying. You are not disloyal for finally wanting to be heard in your own family. You are not behind some schedule everyone else seems to be keeping. You are exactly where you need to be, sitting right here with me, tonight, finally ready to stop swallowing what was always yours to say. Sleep well tonight if you can, and when that old familiar quiet tries to talk you out of your own voice again tomorrow, I hope some small part of this evening stays with you right where you need it.